Okay, I want to give a little bit of some thoughts and feedback and some notes that I sort of hashed out on the goals and objectives um, to provide a little more information. So one, and this comes through really clearly in the reading that goals are long-term, broad, kind of a focus area, whereas objectives are measurable. Um, that's a key point that comes through the reading. There are other acronyms that are used in grant writing sometimes. My wife and I were just talking about SMART is what SPA uses, and that's the idea that objectives should be, it's like abbreviation, like they should be specific, measurable, actionable, reasonable, and within a specific timeline. But I really think if you focus on the measurable part, if they're measurable within the goal period, then that would mean that they're specific. It would mean that they're achievable, and you would be able to accomplish them within a specific timeline. So objectives, I think, are the more, in some ways, important in that area, that they meet that criteria. But again, I think the big point would be that they're measurable, that in some way or another you can measure them. And I think the chapter does a really good job of giving you examples of objectives that are not measurable, that don't meet that criteria, and then other ones that do. For this class, I think if you're wondering about how many, I would say that in terms of goals, you could really get away with just having one goal if you have enough, if it's broad enough to give you room for a couple different specific measurable objectives. And I would kind of suggest that you not do more than 3, maybe 4 goals, because again, each goal you want to be able to operationalize through a set of objectives, and then underneath the objectives, activities that would help you meet those goals and objectives. So I think if you were to do more than 3, that would be a lot to try to break down and to operationalize. So again, in general, I would stick to about 1 to 3, maybe 4 goals for the class. They should be ambitious but achievable. I think we've already talked about connected to data presented in your statement of need. And I wanted to clarify this a little bit and specify what I mean here. So it's not always clear cut, but let's say you want to start your overall project is to start a mentoring program for students of color in the Muncie area who are living in poverty. Well, I've already shared with you that there's easily accessible demographic data, and let's say these are high school students. So for Muncie Central High, you can clearly get data to present your needs statement on the number of students, the number of students of color, the number of students who are living in poverty, or on, which again I've mentioned before is the number on free and reduced lunch. So if you have 350 students of color, 60% of the population of the overall school are students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, that would make it, if your program was going to target maybe 25 students, then it's very clear to me from the data presented that you have a pool of students large enough, presumably, to draw from. That's an achievable number, given the statistics, the demographics, and those types of things. But that's something that a grant reviewer is always going to be looking at. Like, if you're proposing to target 25 or 30 students, do you have the pool of students to draw from? Is this achievable? Given the amount of funding, is it ambitious? Does it kind of meet with the goals? All right, so think carefully about your objectives and what you should focus on. I put here, differentiate between your objectives and the activities or methods needed to achieve those objectives. So what I mean here, like, I've tried to convince you in other videos and in other notes that I've sent you to not employ or focus on employing people. Again, no foundation supports that I'm aware of. The Ball Brothers Foundation doesn't support salary or employment. It's just too legally complicated. And I've also mentioned to you that if you don't understand how to do like what FTE relates to, or fringe, or those kinds of things, then it's just then it just takes more time and more grant experience before you would focus on something like that. But even that, you wouldn't want to make that your objective, because that really should never be the like final outcome. So objectives are always really tied to the kind of mission, the focus of your project, the mission, what you want to have as an outcome of the project. That's different than the methods and the activities and the things you would need to get you to those objectives and to meet those goals. And that's what you want to think about and kind of begin to differentiate. Now, I want to clarify something. For the table that I sent you, I put in there a list of activities. And I do think it's good in your goals and objectives section to begin to flesh out your activities or your methods. But technically speaking, you could wait and do that more in your methods section. I just kind of think it's good to begin to sort of flesh those out. And I think that it works well to include them in the table for the goals and objectives and to begin to think about them. And then you can flesh them out in more detail in your methods section. Also in your methods section and for your goals and objectives table, you don't need to have the person's responsible necessarily or the timeline, things like that. You can create other tables and do that in your methods section. But again, that could be something that's helpful to include along with your goals table. The reason for doing the tables is, one, often you can single space, and for the purposes of this class, you can single space your tables, but it helps save you a lot of room. But it's also very visually easy for your reviewer to look down, see what your specific goals are, and to follow the corresponding objectives, activities, timeline, and so forth. So I would say that tables are pretty much ubiquitous in grant writing. Like, it's a key feature of writing grants. You should have both the table, though, and a written narrative. The table actually has the specific goals, the objectives, the activities. The narrative should help you connect what your goals and objectives are to things like research. So again, if I'm including as my goal a mentorship program for students of color and poverty, I can easily cite some research that shows that that's an effective strategy, that mentor programs have proven to be an effective means for, let's say, preparing students of color and poverty for college enrollment or for post-secondary opportunities. So you can use research, and then also you want to connect to your sponsor's mission. So like a statement like consistent with the mission of the Ball Brothers Foundation, which I believe is enhancing the livelihoods of people in the Delaware County community. You would say this fits with that mission. These goals are consistent with the mission of the Ball Brothers Foundation. And I think it's really good to, again, kind of like write those out and have those in the narrative section. You can also talk about how you came up with your goals, how they connect to your data in your needs assessment. So there's a narrative section, and then you should have a table with your actual goals, objectives, and activities. So you want both of those. Your goals and objectives should be focused on your target population or the community you plan to serve. So I've sort of mentioned a little bit about that already, but again, the objectives should be things that are focused on the mission or the project, which again is focused on the target population. Realistic, something you can accomplish and measure within the timeline. You can also talk about that in your narrative, that maybe you went with, again, for the mentorship program, maybe you started off with 10 students because you wanted to make sure you could get enough volunteers, or you wanted to make sure you had were able to provide a very personalized set of services, or because your services are so in depth, you needed to narrow it to a smaller number. You can use the narrative to kind of justify and to also convey that this is something that's that is realistic. I wanted to kind of touch on something that's related in the book chapter. For foundations, you will come up with your goals and objectives. Again, they should be consistent with the mission, but there will be something you develop. Now, I have tried again in previous videos and in emails I've sent to tell you to avoid at this point writing grants for federal agencies. There might be some exceptions. I've mentioned this, sometimes the National Endowment for the Humanities has some grants, programs that are feasible for first-time grant writers, but generally speaking, you want experience writing grants before you get into a large federal grant. And for the purposes of this class, a federal grant would be too large. But the other thing is too that federal grants the agencies do a lot of research themselves. They know what they want to target and they specify your goals and objectives. So if you were doing a grant for the Office of Violence Against Women or the Department of Justice, they have a set of programs under their grants, and you would find the program you're interested in or that maybe aligns to your organization. But that grant program would generally specify the goals and oftentimes the objectives too, that they want. They've done research, they know the goals and objectives, and what they want is an agency that can develop the methodology, the activities, and the ability to meet those goals and objectives. But oftentimes in those programs, your goal and objective tables is really just stating the goals that come from their notification, and then you set up a system to meet those. And that's why on some of the feedback I gave you to those of you earlier who were looking at federal agencies, if you're adamant about doing that, which again, I would strongly try to push you away from, but you would need to find the specific grant that, I'm trying to think of the right name for it, but the right grant opportunity that you're working with, or the grant program, to derive your goals from that program. And then one of the things in the table that you might have noticed is I have like kind of when I first saw them, I thought they were kind of weird, those numbering systems where it's like goal 1 and then objective 1.1 and then activity 1.1.1 and then activity 1.2.1 or whatever. Those can seem weird, but that's actually to help you later on in the grant. And I think that granting agencies like to see those because when you do your evaluation plan, you don't have to continually rewrite out all of your goals and objectives. You just write objective 1.1 and then how you're going to measure it. And the reviewer, if they have any questions about it, can then refer back to your table. Again, that's why you use a table. Just looks back at your table and goes, oh, there's 1.1, and then they know that aligns to the evaluation methodology. But even later in your grant program, if it gets funded, then when you write your evaluation reports, when you write your, you can just include your table and then your measurements and the outcomes. But you can do that not only in your evaluation, but in your timeline table, in your persons responsible table, all those different sections. Then if you have a numbering system, you don't have to rewrite each goal verbatim. You just use that numbering system to clarify what you're talking about. So these were just some things that came off of the top of my head that I hope are helpful for you guys. And I thought at least hopefully, built a little bit on what was included in the readings. And I'll just say again that I think the chapter for this week does do a really good job of giving you a lot more help in terms of looking at specific examples for writing your objectives. And I would be more than happy to read or look over a table or look over your objectives and try to give you my feedback before you submit the assignment at the end of the week. So hope this is helpful.